Hi, I'm Mara Webster with In Creative Company, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by the wonderful Morgan Spector to talk all about the series, The Gilded Age. And starting off, I know that when you first got the role, you had the chance to sit down with Julian Fellows and really talk about George Russell as a character, as well as the show itself, and even just some of the ideas that you were excited to dig into, such as, the labor law practices and all of that we've seen narratively in season two. And I was interested in how those early conversations with Julian about not just the character, but the themes that the show itself was going to explore really helped you in figuring out how you wanted to play him in the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we sat down. I'm trying to think when it was. It was like sometime early, spring of 2020, and I was like all in on, Bernie Sanders, socialist takeover of America. Was really hoping to be like lining people up against the wall and expropriating their wealth and all of that stuff. And no, I'm just kidding. So that was very much that sort of those politics were very much on my mind. And when I sat down to talk to Julian, and so I was really keen to sort of talk about the labor stuff because it's such a that late 19th century period of American labor formation and
Yeah.
uprising is such an important part of American history. And I felt like I hadn't really known much about it until I started looking into it, on my own through my own interest. And so I really wanted the show to get into it. And yeah, I don't know, talking with Julian, I wish I could remember some of the, he always has he's such an open-minded, curious person. He's so interested in history. And so he had so much sort of wonderful detail to talk to me about. I actually had read one of the books that I think he used for research. So we talked about that a little bit in this book called King Lear and the Gilded Age, which is a wonderful book. I recommend it to anyone if you're interested in the period, because it's a memoir by an heiress from the era, Elizabeth Drexel, and whose portrait hangs in one of the mansions that we use as a set.
Yeah.
And it's just the story. She ends up writing so beautifully, actually, about the eccentricities of the people of this class, and all of the insane things that they got up to with their enormous wealth. But yeah, Julian really had Julian had such always has had such clarity about who George is. It's this sort of duality that we see with him. Um, that he is both utterly ruthless uh, and without scruple in the sort of world of business, and also really tender and loving and affectionate with his family, um, and figuring out how to navigate that really stark dichotomy and sort of make a human being that feels coherent. I think that is and was the challenge with George, and that was sort of how Julian laid it out for me when we first sat down together.
Do you feel like you found much more of a comfort level with that dichotomy of the two sides, and especially just with the fact that, whenever we see him in any sort of workplace or business setting, that's the more ruthless side. And then obviously being able to have scenes with Carrie and Thaisa and like all of the family members is kind of the space where the tenderness really comes out. And so the fact that they're separate actually makes it feel very real to him.
Hmm. Yeah, it feels. I think that's right, and I think what I found is that the one really motivates the other. Like his absolute love of his family leads him to have this like sort of unscrupulous willingness, or that he leads him to have this capacity for ruthlessness in service of protecting that. Right. So it's his delicate feelings towards his family that force him to build these very high ramparts to sort of protect that the family within.
And I've heard you in describing playing him before as well, that there are limits and there are certain parameters and lines to his moral code, even with some of the things that we do see him engaging in and doing. And so what has that journey been like for you in terms of playing a character like that and figuring out what are the lines and what are the parameters that he won't step outside of?
Yeah, I mean, some of that has really, in the first season, we saw George being absolutely willing to drive a man to ruin in revenge for the man trying to do the same to him, which I think we can sort of understand that. I mean, somebody tried to destroy him, they failed. And so he was willing to allow that person to be destroyed. I don't think he wanted that guy to kill himself, but I do think he was willing to see him just utterly ruined and cast out of society. but yes, in the second season, there's this question of how will George resolve this strike? Well, how far is he willing to go? Is he willing to go as far as Clay, his secretary, who wants him to fire on workers directly and just execute them? Or is that a bridge too far? And I think it's not necessary to view George as some kind of as having had some humanitarian impulse awakened inside of him. I mean, I think if you were to, even with the kind of power that these people had, if you were to gun down dozens of workers in cold blood, that would play very badly in the press. It would damage your reputation enormously. I mean, I think that it would have been there are pragmatic reasons not to try to resolve issues in that kind of savage way. And so I think to some extent I think George very much has a moral compass and he has lines he won't cross. But I think he's also he's a really practical, strategic thinker. And so we're always seeing a kind of mix of those things. And I think sometimes it's hard to unpack, have we crossed a moral line here, or does George just have a better idea about how he's going to get out of the situation?
And it is really interesting when you step back and you look at the wider lens of the character as well, in terms of the more scrupulous side of himself, because those aren't actions that are coming from a place of happiness and joy. It's
Mm,
usually coming from some sort of cycle and feeling of pain or anger or
mm.
frustration. And so when you started playing him, how did you set about making sure that anytime that you're kind of going into that side of him, that it's always really strongly motivated from something within him and his past?
That's interesting. Um, yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what on the business side, George is often, he's his I think the sort of status quo for George is that his businesses are thriving and they are profitable. So and they continue to expand. And so when we see him, when we see his frustration, we see his rage is often because that sort of status quo has encountered an obstacle. And I think for someone like George, becoming an obstacle to him is an outrage. It is not the thing. I think he takes it personally, um, and to some extent, although I think he is also again like he's able to be a kind of big picture, macro strategic thinker. But yeah, I do think especially in the first season, what we see this group of town grandees try to take him down and try to destroy his business, and take food out of the mouths of his children. I mean, in a certain way. Um, and yeah, of course, like at that point, all bets are off. It's like you've come for the king. Um, and yeah, in the second season, I think the thing we see at the end of the second season with George and the workers when he goes to the union leader's home is George not necessarily softening, but seeing how the interests of his workers are just in conflict with his interests, and that there is pain there that is in the way that they're forced to live, that if he were in that situation, he would want what they want. And so there's empathy there, even though there's not necessarily a willingness to concede. And I think so. Yeah, it's the thing of being a TV actor where somebody says, "Okay, here's what happens," and then you have to figure out um, how that makes sense emotionally for you. Yeah.
Definitely. And in terms of playing him overall in the series, because obviously George and Bertha very much stand for new money, and there's kind of a really modern feel to them within the setting of a period piece. And so when you were trying to figure out how to play him, what were kind of the defining details in really figuring out what does this element of modernity look like within the structure of a period piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, part of that is the writing because I think there is this element of uh there's an egalitarian quality to their relationship. They trust each other, they respect each other, they give each other space, and ultimately they really depend on one another emotionally and practically in a lot of ways. And I think there's fundamentally a modernity in that. I mean, that is not how, when we hear Christine Baranski's character talk about her marriage, it doesn't resemble that at all. And when we hear I mean, ironically, when we hear Bertha make her plans for Gladys's marriage, that is not the kind of relationship she envisions. She's picturing something much more, much more like the old money marriages, because that's going to cement her status in a certain way. Um, so yeah, I think there is that written in, and then there's also, I think for Carrie and I in the playing, there has been pleasure in sort of figuring out what our private selves look like, when we're not being observed by servants or family or anything else. What that when I come into her room and sit on a chair and we just chat and sort of debrief about the day, what how sort of more how relaxed that can be, and how so what our intimacy looks and feels like. And I think that's also part of
Yeah.
pushing that distinction, pushing the distinction of this relationship. Yeah.
Mhm. And within the marriage as well, he's incredibly supportive of everything that Bertha's pursuing, and even to the point where he's willing to put money into the opera wars, but he doesn't necessarily tell her because he wants her to be able to enjoy it as her own success. But I was curious if you think that they both know, it's kind of a conversation that they've never had, but they both actually know underneath it all.
I suspect yes. I don't think, Bertha's no fool. When there's no money and then all of a sudden, her husband looks into it and now there's money. Like, I don't know. It seems like but yes, I think it's maybe the kind of thing that she just doesn't think about because she doesn't want to. And George gives her that ability to just sort of feel like and so much of it is her success, but he wants her to really, have the pleasure of that. And I think, um, yeah, I mean, I think, Carrie has talked about how in another era, she would have been a senator or something like that, right? I think this is a person who was ambitious and brilliant and wanted power and all those things, and she would have, but she couldn't in this era, and so this is what she can do. And I think, when I think George recognizes that in her. I mean, I don't think he's any kind of proto-feminist or anything like that, but I think he sees her as someone who, by nature, is a peer, and so wants her to have the experience of exercising dominion over her world. And I think he also thinks that's also flattering to him, right? I mean, it all sort of works. Yeah.
Yeah. One of the parts of the show that I was rewatching from the season was that final episode, and in particular, you know, those final moments going into the opera and realizing, okay, everybody's here. And I love the detail with George that he is like, go enjoy your
Mm,
success. And he holds himself back while she goes out by herself to have that moment. And no part of him is claiming any of that.
mm.
And I thought that was such a beautiful detail between the two of them. And I was curious if that was kind of always written that way in the script, or if kind of that staging of the scene was something that you all found when you were filming that moment.
It's both. I mean, I think, I think that was the intention of that moment. But also, yes, like because when we figured out that we had that capacity to sort of, there's a step there and she gets to come down. So it's,
Yeah.
I could sort of stand there as I come through the door and watch her have the experience that she's having, which is really fulfilling for George. And, um, and then she gets to sort of go out into the opera space. I love that moment in the show, actually. I think it works so well. Um, I was surprised by how effective it was when she comes out and she's gotten everything she wants. And really it's a testament to Carrie and how much we just root for her. Because yeah, I don't know. I just always think, why are we rooting for this character? But I think it's her. I think it's just the way she plays it. I think there's something fundamentally just like you admire her moxie and her pluck um, and you can see her need. You can see how much she needs it, and she gets it.
Yeah. And with what you were talking about earlier in terms of figuring out how to play the two different sides, and in particular the more soft and vulnerable side of George,
Hmm.
what was that journey like in the beginning of season one, and really just figuring out how does that manifest itself in a character like this?
Hmm. I mean, the wonderful thing is that there are all of these great moments that Julian has written, where George does yield the spotlight to Bertha, or he gets to have a moment to admire her, or he's sort of treating her with this like courtly grace. And there are just all of these opportunities to sort of find that dynamic and invest in it. And similarly with Gladys, there are these great scenes where Bertha and Gladys have this sort of ongoing tension, and George gets to go in and be the peacemaker and be the one who, lets Gladys know that she's loved and that her parents care about her, because I think often she doesn't feel that way. Um, and so yeah, that's I think, taking advantage of those scenes and the sort of the potential that each of them have to reveal that aspect of George was really just,
Yeah.
that was what it was.
Also, Sonia Warfield, who writes the show alongside Julian Fellows,
Yeah.
has said that one of her favorite things to write are pressure cooker situations
Mm.
between the two of them in their marriage, and to kind of see how they respond to that.
Mm.
And it's actually really lovely to see how much communication does come to the table. There are moments where they withhold things, obviously, but also they face a lot head on, and they're not afraid to say things out loud to each other. And so, how did you and Carrie kind of find the way that you wanted to play those dynamics of when everything is closing in on them from the outside? How
Mm.
do they kind of come together and forge through?
Yeah, I mean, I love those scenes too, and I love how much communication there is between them. I think part of it is just that coming into this job, I knew Carrie's work very well. We knew each other a little bit, and we had worked together once before and done a really, really silly short film where she cuts off my tongue at one point, and with like a butter knife, and I don't know. We already had this kind of almost, we had spent 2 silly days together doing a short film, but so there was that element of like, well, I'm not going to embarrass myself in front of you, and then also I had so much admiration and respect for her work that there is really just like easy trust between us. So when we get in those situations, I'm gonna it's very straightforward and simple. I listen to her ideas and I have my ideas, and we just, go back and forth. And it's, um, there's a kind of nice overlap between my regard for her as an actor and a person and George's regard for Bertha as a kind of peer. So I don't know. I think those scenes are really a pleasure to play, but they also come very naturally.
Mhm. And even just having heard you talk previously about shooting your very first scenes and the fact that it was like the two of you together and kind of her being part of what made you feel more at ease. But when you look back, what were some of those nerves and trepidations that you had on the first couple of days that you were filming and really finding
Yeah.
everything?
I mean, the first scene we shot was our first scene in season one, in the first episode. And you just don't know. I haven't done a lot of period work, especially on camera. And, you know, is the way you just have all of those, is the way I'm speaking going to be credible? Is the way that I'm moving how do I move in this body, in these clothes? And as much as you've rehearsed or thought about it or practiced or whatever, the first day that you do it, you feel ridiculous and tense and awful. And I think we were both in that place, and we, did a few takes where we were both just kind of, you feel like you have egg on your face. And but yeah, but we were able to talk about that, in the moment to some degree, and then relax and sort of settle in. But yeah, I mean there's a technical challenge to making this kind of a show that for me was new. And I've done period stuff before, but nothing, the sort of social constraints of this era are unique. And so that was challenging for sure from the beginning. But I'm glad we had each other to go through it together and figure it out.
Because even what you're bringing up there about figuring out the movement of the character, for example, it's not just how does this character move, it's also all of the details that go into that time period as well. There's a lot of putting on gloves and taking them off, and putting on hats and taking them off, and
Yeah.
what do I need to do when I walk into this space with my wife versus like how do I need to walk into a room with business partners. And so what was that aspect of figuring out the physicality of the character, which you do anyway, but then
Mhm.
the added elements of also in terms of just etiquette in the time period?
Yeah, I mean, it's fortunate we have advisors on set all the time who will say, no, 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 you would take your gloves off here. And you're like, but this is going to take me an hour. Like, how am I going to do this? This is ridiculous. But then, of course, you do it a couple times, and by then, and suddenly the scene is like, very easily about, a person who's in the middle of taking off their gloves and saying, doing something else at the same time. Often that kind of business, that little kind of action ends up really helping the scene and really lifting it up. But all of those things initially, when you first encounter them, oh, I've got to take my hat off. Oh, I've got to, I've got to remove my glove. I've got to put my glove back on. All of those things are technical challenges that then sort of become your friends. They become, they go from they end up being props, but they start out as completely foreign ideas.
Was that kind of similar as well in terms of the language? Because there's a real rhythm and almost like a musicality to the delivery of it, which is wonderful. But I imagine it takes a little while to kind of finesse and find that.
Yeah, it does, and it's we're it's hard to know exactly. There isn't much to listen to in terms of how these people spoke. There are recordings of some people from this era, but they tend to be moments of oratory. So, because that was what tends to be recorded, and it doesn't. So, for me, it doesn't give you a great sense of like how these people actually spoke. And we've made some decisions collectively early, before we started shooting about how they were going to sound. And yeah, mastering that dialect essentially is it's an ongoing process. We have a speech person on set who's always listening. Howard Samuelson, who I always, he deserves a ton of credit because he's sort of keeping all of us in the period by just being relentless and listening to us.
Yeah. One of the things that I've heard you kind of touch upon before as well that I thought was really interesting was the idea that George is actually very alone. It's kind of that idea of being in a room full of people and feeling quite lonely. He's always around people. But at the same time, Bertha's obviously off on her mission and doing everything that she's doing. And then on his work side, he feels quite isolated and put upon in a certain way. And so what are the ways in which you felt like that really expressed itself through him as a character, that idea of, yes, there's people all around, but on a personal level, I still feel a little bit lonely at the end of the day.
I mean, I think for anyone in his position of power, there is a kind of isolation because you are the decision maker. You're the person who, at the end of the day, you have to take the risk, and if it fails, it's on you. And I think I'm sure I'm sure if you're a person like him, that's exhilarating as well as occasionally lonely. But yeah, I mean, George is somebody who I think he's a people person. I think he's pretty warm with people, and he connects to people. He's not a remote, sort of emotionally aloof person. But we don't really see him have many friends. I mean, I think he's got Clay, his right-hand man, but they have almost a combative camaraderie, the two of them. I mean, they don't always agree. I think, their sort of their way of interacting, it contains a lot of argument and a lot of conflict. And I think that's how it's set up, who are maybe the best idea wins sort of thing. But yeah, otherwise, when it comes down to it, aside from Bertha, and his children, George is really on his own. And yeah, I think that's just sort of fundamentally who he is.
Mm-hmm. And even just what you were talking about there in terms of, he recognizes that he's the decision maker and things have to kind of land on him at the end of the day. Did you feel like that and kind of his moral compass was part of why he's there on the front lines when there's the situation with the workers, because he doesn't want to pass that along to anybody else? He's like, I'm the person that has to deal with this, and I'm very aware of that.
Yes, I think that's right. I think in a certain way that's very honorable that he doesn't want to. And actually, I think the Homestead strike was something we were referencing, and a number of workers did die in the Homestead strike, although not because they were directly fired upon. There was a sort of exchange, like it was messier than the situation that's presented in our show. But in that story, Frick was Andrew Carnegie's right-hand man, and he was there, and Carnegie left the country. At least one can sort of speculate, in part because he didn't want to get his hands dirty with this situation. He wanted whatever happened to not really be on him. Maybe that's unfair, but I think it's a little bit reasonable to speculate that's the case. And in contrast, George says, no, I'm going to be here and be the person who makes this call and makes these decisions. And I think that's also because he doesn't necessarily trust anybody else to really represent his interests in a heightened moment like that. And yeah, I think he's right not to. I think there's a reasonable case to make that if it had been up to Clay, he would have just killed all those dudes. And yeah, I think that would have redounded really badly on George's reputation and his company. And this is still, as much as George is alone, business is still social, and you still need you still need to be able to go around people and have them trust your name and your word. And if you're the kind of person who will just execute men in cold blood, I think that tends to negatively impact your ability to maybe do business. Yeah. I mean, there was also a press at this time. There was, that would have been in newspapers. So
Yeah. And then in terms of talking about him as a father as well, that's another space as well where he colors outside of the lines. It's like, yes, he wants his daughter to find someone who is a great match and of the right social status, but he also really does understand the importance of her having someone where it can be an emotional partnership and that she actually has genuine feelings for, in part because that's what he has with his wife as well. And so kind of like, what did those details tell you about him when you looked at the father-daughter relationship? Because again, it's a little bit different to what we usually see in the time period.
yeah, I think it sort of falls on George to be the emotional, affectionate parent, which, yeah, is definitely not of the period. And because Bertha is so ambitious, and and her ambitions and her sort of long-term plans for their family really require Gladys to play a certain role. And George finds himself, I think, again and again in the position of reassuring Gladys that her life isn't going, that she isn't just going to be used as a pawn in some, in this like larger strategic game for their family. Um, and yeah, I mean, Thaisa Farmiga is a wonderful actor. And yeah, I just, a couple of times a season we'll have those scenes where we get to just go in there and Bertha's done something, horrible to Gladys and made her feel 3 inches tall. And, I have to George has to go in there and try to let her know that there's hope and that that she still has some possibilities for a life. And yeah, there aren't that many things that George has really laid out as like red lines. Like these are the things that this is something I really care about. Um, but that's one of them, is that Gladys find a love match. And I think, as you said, that's exactly right, is that it's because um, that's what he has in his life, and he knows how much it means to him, and he can't imagine, living without it, and he doesn't want that for his daughter. Um, so yes, I think I'm looking forward to how we address that in season 3. I think it's going to be an interesting conflict.
I mean, it must be so rich overall in getting to play a character who very much is willing to kind of color outside of the lines and create their own rule book in every facet of their life. Because that's essentially how he's built his success, is by creating his own rule book along the way. And did you find that the parameters of finding what that looks like for him in a character were very much on the page for you early on, or did you kind of figure out that journey a little bit along the way?
I mean, it's always a little bit of both, but I think, the nice thing about George is that he really, like, as you're saying, he's a creative thinker. And there's a sense that he might go any which way. I mean, he has some sort of conservative strains in his character. I mean, I think, for instance, when it comes to his son, he's, my son will follow in my footsteps and, be an echo of me in the world. And, he doesn't really give it much more thought than that. I mean, there are some ways in which he is quite conventional. But I think for the most part, what's exciting about him is that, um, in the second season, we see he's willing to take on all of the other tycoons and go in a completely other direction. He really is, like, the solitude we were speaking of, the kind of loneliness of George is also, it also means that he doesn't feel beholden to any convention, to any particular social grouping. I mean, the scene in season 1 where he buys out the whole bazaar, he sees these sort of social mores as, these are just things you can trample upon if they're in your way at a certain point. And so that's an exciting character. When you don't know what somebody might do, when a character is unpredictable, I think that's definitely the most exciting kind of character to play.
It's also a huge part of why watching him on screen is such a wonderful experience as an audience member. And I
Of
love all these thoughts and details that have gone into him. So thank you so much for sharing all of it. Really appreciate it, Morgan.
course, my pleasure. Thank you. It's wonderful to speak to you.